Mike Rodak covers Alabama. Bama 247. He joins us on 365 Sports with Paul Craig, and I'm David Smoke. Mike, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. How would you say the first, been 3 weeks or so of the fall camp have gone for Alabama, even though that's always a generic question, but just the way things look?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a SEC football team, which, if you asked me on January 12th or 13th, when everything had just gone down with Nick Saban, there was a lot of questions on how the transition would go and, would this all crumble? And I mean, it looks like a team that, as they've been picked by a lot of people, are number 5 in the country, number 3 or 4 in the SEC. It still looks like a pretty good product on the field. And, we're actually getting to see practice, which is new, from the Nick Saban era, or at least the last 4 years in the Nick Saban era, we weren't allowed to watch practice. So just the mere fact that our eyes are out there is something different.
Mike, obviously the depth is not going to be the same. They lost 31 players in the portal. That's not a number they ever really had to deal with before, but they've got some talented guys. They got some talented guys back in the portal, but is that the real concern that, they won't be able to weather the storm with, 5-star, 5-star, 5-star on the 3 deep for at least another year or two?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is a concern. That's something that Nick Saban's mentioned, when he's been on TV talking about Alabama, which is, something I think we're all still getting used to here. And it's something that's going to be kind of lingering around this team, is the weekly opinion of Nick Saban. But that is something that he's mentioned. His depth is a concern. And they've been fortunate so far in that they've been very healthy, in training camp so far. They did have one injury at wide receiver in spring, with Jalen Hale missing the season, the Texas native. But you look at Texas and they've lost running backs. You look at Notre Dame losing its offensive tackle. Alabama's avoided that sort of situation. If they do have that at some point during the year, and this season with the 12-team playoff could be longer, there would be some concerns. I think the offensive line would be a big area where if they lose a starter, and they have some really good ones up there, that would be a problem. The secondary has a lot of young players, a lot of inexperience. If they lose the starter to an injury there, that would also be a problem. There's some positions, as usual, are deeper than others. But there's definitely some areas where I would have major concerns about this team if they had an injury or two.
A lot of buzz, a lot of talk about Jalen Milroe. I mean, there always is with a starting quarterback, but after some of the glimpses we saw last year and just having another year under his belt, and now obviously a very fun offense to play in, just what's the kind of excitement level and what's maybe some noticeable differences as Jalen returns this year with all that experience he garnered a year ago?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely the unquestioned leader of this team. He's the guy that I think all the players are looking to. He was a team captain by the end of last year, but people forget he began last season in the quarterback battle. I mean, there was the whole cake in the oven analogy from Nick Saban at media days last year, and there was a lot of questions going into even that Texas game last year, and then coming out of it, he gets benched. I think confidence-wise, leadership-wise, that didn't have a great effect on him. But in the 12 months since, he's really developed a different level of confidence where, you walk around that building, that Jalen Milroe is in charge, in terms of, the locker room. So that's a big difference. But in terms of the offense, I mean, we'll just have to see exactly how he fits into this. I think Kalen DeBoer has shown he can really open it up in the passing game. I do think he wants to have a precision passer that can move the chains and get those first downs. Milroe has shown some of that, but I think there's still some questions on just a down in and down out basis. Is he making the right decisions? Is he making the right reads? Is he touching the ball and running when he should? Those are all, pretty big questions with him, and we'll just have to see what happens when, they actually play a game.
How much the throw against Auburn was obviously a miracle type play. Then they beat Georgia. Obviously, right there right on the cusp of possibly beating Michigan. How much of those last 3 games feeds him? How much carryover do you feel like you might see from him?
Yeah, I agree. There was that month of November for him, the LSU game where he really outdueled Jaden Daniels. He goes to Kentucky and has a great game. Has the winning play against Auburn, even though maybe the whole product in that game wasn't great, and then has really the marquee game. Even though the stat line wasn't out of this world for him to go and do what he did against Georgia, avoid mistakes against that defense, play a really clean game. That was what he needed to do. His Michigan game was not great. I think the offensive line was an issue for him, but he also made some bad decisions. He, fumbled the ball in a pretty key moment, and that's the last game that he played. So that is one of the things. It's like, I think there's been a lot of positive momentum around him in whatever it's been, 9 months since almost, but that's still the last game he played. He hasn't really been on the field since. So we'll have to see, just again, what happens when, in their first 2 games are against Western Kentucky and South Florida, and he might put up 300 yards passing and whatever the case may be. It's really going to be going to Wisconsin and then coming back and playing Georgia at home, where I think we're going to see where Jalen Milroe is as a fourth-year senior.
How do you feel about Ty Simpson and the guys behind him on the depth chart right now?
I think Ty is a really interesting case because he's a guy that was a borderline 5-star prospect, has really not played almost at all at Alabama. He has not transferred. He's just kind of squatted and waited his turn, and I think is still – I don't know if he would ever publicly say this, and we really haven't talked to him, but I'm sure he's thinking in the back of his head, if Jalen Milroe has a few bad games this year, there's probably going to be some people calling for me to step in. I mean, he had a chance to play a little bit against South Florida last year when Milroe was benched. There was rumblings among fans, during that Rose Bowl against Michigan, should they put Ty Simpson into this game? And if things don't go well early in this year for Alabama, I think we might hear Simpson's name bubble up. And he's gotten better behind the scenes, like in the spring, in the fall. Like he's made strides. And again, he's just kind of stuck around when he could have gone somewhere else and played. So he's really that guy. The other 2 guys in the depth chart are younger, and we'll have to see what happens to them long term because they have Keelan Russell, also from Texas, coming in as a 5-star quarterback next year.
I was going to ask you about the fact that there's just a couple of Texas guys on the roster. Usually Bama has, a handful of guys under Saban, and they've got Milroe, obviously, but you also mentioned Jalen Hale. He's the only other Texan on this year's roster. No, he had the major injury. Just what's the latest on him?
Well, a couple others, too. Jam Miller, the running back from Texas, their starting right guard. Jaden Roberts could be a day 2 NFL draft pick next year, also from Texas. So they do have a few. But Jalen Hale it's tough to say. I don't think they're willing to say he's absolutely not going to play this year. I think the odds are probably still against it. If it does happen, it's probably later in the season in the playoff. If they go deep, obviously it's January 20th is the national championship game this year. So theoretically, there's a little bit of runway there. I think there's a little bit more optimism recently than there was in the spring when it happened. But I think the best or the most likely course of action is that he probably misses this year and that they try to get him back and up to speed next spring.
By the way, for those who have not seen this, Mike wrote a phenomenal story. These are the stories I love to read. 10 years ago, Kalen DeBoer slept on the floor of a 2-bedroom apartment at Eastern Michigan. In one bedroom was Ryan Grubb. In the other was Ron McKeefrey, who is now the culture guy for Alabama. How much fun did you have kind of tracking this thing down and kind of give us a little background on all that?
Yeah, I mean, Kalen DeBoer is a coach who kind of came out of nowhere, I think, for a lot of people, not only in Alabama, but in college football, because he came up in, North Dakota, South Dakota, Sioux Falls, and was really not on the radar for most college football fans until maybe he was at Washington last year. I don't think a lot of people knew him until last year. So he's a guy that, has some humble beginnings, even 10 years ago at Eastern Michigan, being the coordinator and, just trying to move up the ladder and living with Ryan Grubb, who's always been his kind of right-hand man. His offensive coordinator at Washington was going to be the offensive coordinator at Alabama until the Seattle Seahawks came calling, and they stole him as their coordinator. So, Ron McKeefrey's been a strength coach all around, college football, and he is that guy who's left with, DeBoer, who's been around him for a while now, and trying to reestablish that culture, because Alabama had Scott Cochran that I think a lot of college football fans would recognize. He was at Alabama, he was at Georgia, was kind of that hoorah sort of guy in the locker room with the players, and they need that again. And maybe they have that in McKeefrey, but Kalen DeBoer, I will say, is a very down-to-earth, humble, just very grounded coach. Just talking to him, he's just a regular guy. It's a very big change from what everybody's used to with Nick Saban.
One of the things I kind of thought about with Kalen DeBoer and Nick Saban was, I mean, not that he was afraid to take a chance, but he was not the, kind of new school, let's go for it on every fourth down, let's damn the torpedoes. He was just so confident that, yeah, sure, I'll punt it at your 42-yard line, knowing that my defense is going to stop you and we might get a defensive touchdown. Kalen DeBoer, I think one of the things that fans are probably going to enjoy or, need to take Tums for is the fact that fourth down's not really a thing to him. He'll say, damn the torpedoes and let's go.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be a different style, a little bit more of I want to say a modern style, but, I think Nick Saban, to some extent wanted to embrace analytics, and he had tons of people on his staff doing all that and giving him that information. But at the end of the day, I think he was still an old school football coach at heart. I mean, Kalen DeBoer is 30 years younger. I think he thinks differently. And we'll have to see how it all works. I remember Lane Kiffin coming into Bryant-Denny Stadium about 3 years ago and going for it on every single fourth down, and Ole Miss was out of that game in about 10 minutes. But you do have to be careful with some of that. But I'm sure there will be a point in time where fans don't like that something that Kalen DeBoer does, or they'll get mad at him about a certain decision. But until that happens, he's kind of that younger, brighter sort of coach that, again, just is a change of pace around here.
Mike, great stuff. Thank you. Love when we get you on the show talking about Alabama. Kalen DeBoer, the era. Mike Rodak with us from Bama 247 on 365 Sports.